The wind across Norfolk Naval Station was thick with salt and the thunder of jet engines, a symphony Commander Sarah Hall had known for over 2 decades. She stood on the observation deck of the aircraft carrier USS Constellation, the massive ship humming with the power of a small city. At 51, her back was still ramrod straight, her dark hair streaked with gray, and pulled into a tight bun. She was a surface warfare officer, a woman who had spent her life mastering the ocean, but today she felt like a stranger on a foreign planet. The carrier was the domain of Admiral James Thornton. A man carved from the old Navy, he was all sharp angles and colder steel. His face, permanently tanned from decades at sea, was a mask of authority. He had commanded ships and men for so long that the two concepts had become one in his mind. To him, the bridge of a carrier was a cathedral of masculine tradition. And Sarah's presence felt, to him, like a desecration. Sarah had been assigned to the Constellation as a senior logistics and operations advisor, a position that required her to coordinate complex supply chains and ensure the strike group had the fuel, food, and ordnance it needed. She was brilliant at her job, known throughout the fleet for her ability to untangle the most impossible logistical knots. But on the carrier, she was an interloper in the Admiral's eyes. The tension had been building for months. It started with small slights, being excluded from senior staff meetings, her recommendations ignored until a male officer repeated them, her nightly strategy briefs pushed to the end of the agenda. Thornton never shouted at her. He was too polished for that. Instead, he wielded a cold, dismissive courtesy that was sharper than any blade. The breaking point came during a critical simulation in the Carrier Intelligence Center. Sarah had identified a fatal flaw in the refueling schedule that would have left two destroyers stranded during a high-speed chase. She presented her data clearly, calmly, and with irrefutable evidence. Admiral Thornton listened, his jaw tight. In front of a dozen officers, he leaned forward and said, his voice dripping with condescension, "Sarah, logistics is about supporting warriors, not complicating their job with feminine handwriting. We'll stick to the plan." The room went silent. It wasn't just the dismissal. It was the implication that her gender made her incapable of strategic thought. Later that day, Sarah was summoned to his private sea cabin. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and polished brass. Thornton didn't ask her to sit. "Commander Hall," he began, not looking up from a report. "I am finding your presence on this ship disruptive. You create friction where there should be fluidity." Sarah stood her ground. "Admiral, I am simply trying to prevent an operational failure." He finally looked up, his blue eyes like ice. "I don't need a logistics officer who questions every order. I need obedience. This command requires a specific temperament. A temperament you clearly lack." Before she could respond, he picked up a phone. "Master at Arms, please report to my cabin to escort Commander Hall from the vessel." He looked back at her. "You are hereby relieved of your duties and restricted from this carrier." Effective immediately, Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Escorted off the ship. In front of the entire crew, she would be marched down the gangplank like a criminal. The walk across the hangar bay felt like a mile-long parade of humiliation. Sailors stopped their work, their eyes burning holes in her back. The only sound was the clack of her heels and the heavy boots of the master-at-arms behind her. As she stepped onto the pier, the sheer impossibility of her situation crashed down on her. She was a commander in the United States Navy, an expert in her field, and she had just been exiled from her post for the crime of being too competent and too female. She had no ship, no command, and a reputation now stained by the Admiral's public scorn. The fight wasn't over. It had just changed its nature. The sting of the expulsion didn't fade with the salty Norfolk air. It calcified into a cold, hard resolve. Sitting in a sterile temporary office at the naval station, surrounded by boxes of files she was no longer allowed to manage, Sarah Hall did the unthinkable. She requested a meeting with the one man who could challenge the might of a carrier strike group, Captain Jonathan Vance, the commanding officer of the USS Titan *, a nuclear-powered attack submarine currently docked for a quiet resupply. The submarine community was a world apart from the brown shoe navy of aviators. They were a silent service, comfortable in the deep, and famously contemptuous of the flamboyant culture of carrier aviation. Captain Vance was a legend in his own right, a man of few words and immense gravitas, known for his tactical genius and his rigid, almost religious, adherence to the Navy's core values: honor, courage, commitment. He was also known for hating Admiral Thornton, The meeting took place in a windowless conference room. Vance sat across from Sarah, his weathered hands clasped on the table, his eyes missing nothing. He had already heard the scuttlebutt, the whispered rumors about the commander who was marched off the carrier. "I don't need sympathy, Captain," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I need an audience. The Constellation Strike Group is sailing in 72 hours. They have a critical flaw in their logistics and refueling protocol." Thornton refused to see it. "If they go to sea like this, in a real-world pursuit, we risk losing ships." Vance raised an eyebrow. "And you want me to call him and tell him his diaper needs changing?" "Thornton won't listen to me, Commander. He thinks we're just silent janitors who clean up his messes." "No," Sarah said, leaning forward. "I want you to refuse to sail." The silence in the room was absolute. For a captain to refuse a direct order from a superior admiral was mutiny. It was the end of a career. It was prison. "You're asking me to hang myself," Vance said quietly, but there was no anger in his voice, only curiosity. "I'm asking you to stand on principle," Sarah countered. "The Titan is the only sub attached to that strike group. You are his deep cover, his hidden eye. If you refuse to get underway, citing a material deficiency in the operational safety of the strike group, you force an inquiry. An inquiry that will have to look at his plans. You have the power to stop this, John." "I don't." Vance stared at her for a long, uncomfortable minute. He thought of his own daughter, a bright young ensign studying logistics at the Naval Academy. He thought of the look on Sarah's face as she described being humiliated for simply doing her job. He thought of the men and women who might die because one man's ego was too big to admit he was wrong. That evening, Vance walked through his boat, the Titan. He ran his hand along a torpedo tube, looked at the faces of his young crew. He was their shepherd. And sometimes, the shepherd had to fight the Volf, even if the Volf wore an admiral's stars. The next morning, a coded message pinged on Admiral Thornton's terminal aboard the Constellation. It was from Captain Vance. It was succinct. Strike Group deployment. USS Titan will not be underway for scheduled exercises. Identified critical operational flaw in Strike Group Command Logistics Framework renders this command unsafe for submerged operations. Request immediate investigation prior to departure. Vance. J. On the bridge of the Constellation, Admiral Thornton read the message and turned a shade of purple usually reserved for storm clouds on radar. A submarine captain, a bubblehead, was openly defying him. And he was using the exact same language, the same data points that Sarah Hall had used days before. The rebellion had begun. The Titan's refusal to sail sent shockwaves through the fleet that registered on a seismic scale. Within hours, the message traffic between Norfolk and the Pentagon was a frantic blur of bytes. Admiral Thornton, fuming in his sea cabin, immediately fired off a blistering response demanding Vance's immediate relief and court-martial for insubordination. He labeled the submarine captain's actions as mutinous, cowardly, and a dereliction of duty, but the Navy doesn't move on temper. It moves on procedure. And Captain Vance had played his hand perfectly. By citing a material deficiency and a risk to operational safety, he had triggered an automatic, non-negotiable investigation. The departure of the strike group was frozen. The investigation was led by a no-nonsense rear admiral from the Judge Advocate General's Course. A woman named Alice Greer, who had a reputation for being utterly immune to political pressure. She set up her headquarters in a hangar bay on the Constellation, turning the space usually reserved for FEA-18 Hornets into a legal battlefield. The first person she called was Captain Vance. He arrived in his dress blues, looking like a monument to naval tradition. He didn't waste time on rhetoric. He laid out, in precise, technical detail, the flaw in the refueling plan. He showed the charts, the fuel consumption rates, the speed variables. He then coolly explained